Greetings, my name is Penalty-Hansten, and this is another lecture in our series, The Death Penalty, Sailing Without the Ballast of Reason. As I mentioned in the introductory video, I come from a scientific background, drug interactions, pharmacokinetics, that sort of thing, and I teach philosophy of science. So I need to justify giving this lecture. I will argue that there's more overlap with science in the death penalty than one might think. For example, what makes bad science, fallacies, reasoning errors, misuse of empirical evidence, all of these things apply to the death penalty as well. And I will argue that a philosophical perspective is always useful when we're dealing with a complex topic. As physician-philosopher William James said, when somebody asked him to explain what philosophy was, he said, "A peculiarly stubborn effort to think clearly." This is one of the first slides I show my students in my philosophy of science class because I think that really captures what we're driving at with philosophical thinking, or we should be driving at anyway. So today's topic is the astonishing complexity of the origins of human behavior. Why do humans act in the way they do? This is one of the most difficult questions anybody can ask. And despite amazing advances by neuroscientists and others, there are still gaping holes in our understanding of human behavior. We need experts, so we will focus on the remarkable book Behave by Professor Robert Sapolsky and others as well. And this whole topic is an example, I think, of the importance of science to the death penalty debate. It's not the only thing, but it's certainly an important aspect of it. So what do I mean by sailing without the ballast of reason? You may have seen this in the introductory video. We need passions and emotions, which represent the wind necessary for the ship to move. And we have no shortage of passions on both sides of the death penalty debate. But without the ballast of reason and rational thought, the ship will founder and sink. So we can't go on wind alone or ballast alone. We really need both. Now there's two parts to this. The first part is, how do we know who deserves to die for their crimes? That's part one. The irony here is that the less one knows about the origins of human behavior, the greater the confidence that it's an easy decision. Now some of you may see echoes of the Dunning-Kruger effect here. I think it's alive and well on this topic. Part two is how this astonishing complexity affects everyone else involved in the death penalty process. Now, there is no cure for this complexity. We can't wish it away. It's just the way we're built. And I will argue that this complexity is one of the strongest arguments against the death penalty because it's the underlying cause of many other problems we have with capital punishment, such as innocence and the arbitrary nature and all the other things, the other problems we have with capital punishment. Now, this is a very heavy topic. It's hard to focus on this for long periods, so I will have occasional quick diversions. I learned this 50 years ago when I first started lecturing, almost 60 years ago, when I first started lecturing on drug-drug interactions. And I was showing slides like this, and after 5 or 10 minutes of this stuff, people's heads started exploding. So I had to give quick breaks, and the same applies here. And by the way, the complexity of this drug interaction that you see on this slide pales in comparison to the complexity of human behavior. Okay, this is a balance of pros and cons on the death penalty. On the left side, we must acknowledge some victims' loved ones, not all, but some victims' loved ones do gain satisfaction when they observe the suffering of the person who murdered their loved one. And we simply can't dispute that. That's a given. And I think we must never forget the victims' loved ones and support them in every way we can with counseling, monetary support, whatever we can do to help them out. But on the con side, we have a lot of stuff. And we'll cover each one of these in subsequent lectures, some in more detail than others. But this is our first for today. This is our first in-depth discussion of one of the downsides, the extreme complexity of human behavior. Now, today's topic is what one of the 5 deal breakers, topics that I argue are the most important reasons to abolish the death penalty. I define a deal breaker as an argument that all by itself renders the death penalty invalid as public policy. And I think a strong case could be made that if any one of these five were the only argument, we should still abolish the death penalty. So let's start with the question, how are we doing in deciding who should die for their crimes and who should be sent to prison? Well, I would argue that we are failing spectacularly. I haven't given many F's in my 60 years of teaching, but here I think it's richly deserved. And this is assuming all these people are guilty. We have a serious problem of sending innocent people to death row, which we'll cover in a later video. So how are we doing? Here's an example. This came from the Death Penalty Information Center last year. All 25 people Oklahoma seeks to execute have a history of damage and deficits that bring into question whether they represent the, quote, worst of the worst offenders. And here's a breakdown. Notice the Venn diagram. 100% of these people had childhood trauma, and more than half of them also had brain injury, intellectual disabilities, or serious mental illness. 7 of them there in the center had the trifecta. They had all 3. But all of these people were still sent to death row. Now, we're not saying turn them loose. Society has to be protected. But you say, many of these problems, or many people with these problems do not murder, and this is absolutely true and totally irrelevant, because the question is, would these 25 people have murdered had they not had these traumas and disabilities? Now, we know these things predispose antisocial and violent behavior, yet the most talented psychiatrists and neuroscientists in the world couldn't answer with certainty if they would have murdered if they had not had these disabilities. Yet we task a jury of average people, quote unquote, to answer a question that the experts couldn't possibly answer. It's simply absurd. So I will argue that in claiming we can assess the origins of negative human behavior, we are committing the great sin of hubris. The ancient Greeks considered hubris a form of pride that's offensive to the gods, so the gods punished mortals for their hubris. A good example was Bellerophon, who hopped on the winged horse Pegasus to fly to the heavens. It didn't end well for Bellerophon. So our monumental hubris is that we know who deserves the death penalty and who should get only life in prison. So defendant A gets executed and defendant B rots in prison. And we actually think we have valid reasons for making that knife-edge decision. But we're actually not that smart, not even close. So why do people commit murder? According to many people, it's very simple. Some people are just evil. This is a Manichaean worldview of the epic battle between good and evil, and we are the good punishing the evil. But I would argue that if you say it's very simple, you are an ultra-crepidarian. An ultra-crepidarian is a person who expresses opinions on matters outside the scope of their knowledge or expertise. You may have noticed this. Currently, we are in an ultra-crepidarian apocalypse. People who think they know more virology than virologists, they know more climatology than climatologists. And as an aside, it's not just lay people pontificating on science. Some of the most pernicious ultra-crepidarians are scientists who don't stick to their lane. During COVID, for example, we had radiologists and surgeons weighing in on vaccinations, a topic about which they usually had no training at all. And the problem is that such people can sound convincing, even actually they are full of it. So in this lecture, we will discuss ultra-crepidarians who claim to understand the origins of human behavior. Now, it's pretty complicated. In my book, Death Penalty Bullshit, I studied what the experts said, and I made this figure. All the usual suspects: genetics, abuse and neglect, parenting, race and gender, mental illness, all these things. And I thought I'd done a pretty good job with this figure, but then I read Behave by Professor Robert Sapolsky. Dr. Sapolsky is an eminent neuroscientist. He's a professor at Stanford. He's written many best-selling books. He's also a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant recipient, an all-around smart guy. And Behave is one of the most fascinating and informative books I have ever read. And as a bonus, he has a very engaging style. It's very enjoyable to read. So the problem is that after reading Sapolsky's Behave, my pathetic and oversimplified little figure you see here became this. So bad behaviors in the center, lots of causes. Now I want to make sure you understand, this is not a scientific figure. It's for the Gestalt. I'm sure Dr. Sapolsky would tweak it. But some connection, well, another point to keep in mind is some of these connections are stronger than others. They've all been reported, but some of them are a lot stronger. And there are 3 reasons why it's even more complex than this figure implies. First of all, it's not complete. I ran out of room. I just couldn't fit anything else on this slide. Secondly, it's rare for a person to have only one cause for negative behavior. It's often multiple, sometimes synergistic. And third, all of these factors can be present in varying degrees. Just take one example, child abuse. It can vary from mild to life-threatening. So when somebody commits a violent act, sorting out all of the precise causes is essentially impossible. So is it simple? It's the opposite of simple. It's so not simple. It's astonishingly complex rather than simple. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche knew how problematic our moral judgments are. He said, our moral judgments and evaluations, too, are only images and fantasies based on physiological processes unknown to us. Now, thanks to Dr. Sapolsky and his fellow neuroscientists, we do know some of the processes that affect human behavior, but some is the operative word. And by the way, Nietzsche would have loved reading Dr. Sapolsky. Nietzsche closely followed the science of his time. And in fact, he was probably on his way to becoming a scientist, but his humanities professors grabbed him before he could get away. They saw he was a genius, and so they gave him a full professorship at the University of Basel in Switzerland at age 24. Unheard of. Never happened. Probably not since either. And they also gave him his PhD without finishing his thesis. So they basically gave him an offer he couldn't refuse, and they sequestered him in the humanities. So this brings up the question, should we have sympathy for murderers and excuse their behavior? No, I'm not suggesting that at all. You can even still hate them if you want. This is about us recognizing our limitations. It's not about them. It's about our absurd claim that we fallible humans can determine with precision how a person became the type of person who would murder and when that person should be killed by the state. Now, we usually decide who should be executed based on how bad the crime is, and some of them are truly horrific. But that's the easy part in most cases. A 10-year-old could do that. But if we want to be rational, which I think the law is supposed to be, we would focus on what caused them to be the type of person who would commit such a crime. That's the hard part. So we do the easy part and ignore the hard part, which is a classic human tendency. And hard is actually the wrong word. It's actually impossible to know with any degree of certainty why people behave in the way they do. We can only make educated guesses. Now let's look at one of the most bizarre features of the death penalty, which relates to this discussion. Death-qualified juries, every juror in a capital case must support the death penalty. I couldn't believe it when I first heard about this. This ensures that the death penalty juries are whiter, more conservative, more male, and more vengeful. And I have a better idea. If they're going to require death penalty qualified juries, we should be able to require them to be Sapolsky qualified. Every juror in a capital case must read Behave by Robert Sapolsky. Now, it's a pretty thick book, so it might take him a while. We'd have to give him a month ahead of time to do this. But if they actually did that, there's no way they could rationally support the death penalty. They would have to engage in magical thinking, because asking a group of people who know next to nothing about the neurobiology of violence to judge which people deserve to die, that's magical thinking. we might as well ask the jury to weigh in on the relative validity of the proposed causes of the Third Punic War of Carthage, Carthage versus Rome. By the way, I selected this because I Googled wars where there's major debate on what caused them. But jurors would know about as much about this as they do about the neurobiology of violence. Okay, here's a palate cleanser. This is Naumburg in central Germany, where Nietzsche spent much of his childhood. I've dragged my long-suffering wife to almost everywhere Nietzsche lived in Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and France. Now back to the figure. Notice that some causal factors appear multiple times on the figure. If we could reduce poverty, for example, it would probably help a lot with this problem. And it gets worse. It's even more complex than you thought because, and I mentioned this a moment ago, it's not all or none. All these factors affecting behavior are not binary, and they're present in varying degrees. And it's also distributed. Some people have a catastrophic event, but usually the causal factors are multiple and distributed over the person's entire life and prenatally as well, and even their ancestors. So it looks kind of like this, with multiple causes of varying degrees all acting together to produce this unwanted effect. And by the way, this distributed causality is not unique to neuroscience. We frequently have to deal with this in my own field of drug-drug interactions. When somebody fails to respond to a drug, we think it's a drug interaction. We have to look at all of the other possible causes, and it's very difficult. So you saw genes in that complex diagram. So what about genes? Can a defendant say my genes made me do it? Well, not really, at least not genes alone. Genes can be important, but it's usually when combined with other factors that increase the risk of violent behavior. So monoamine oxidase alpha can be associated with violent behavior, catechol O-methyltransferase with anger issues, and the oxytocin receptor with aggression. But in each of these cases, only if other things like child abuse, sexual abuse, and drinking alcohol are there at the same time. So the gene variant sets the stage, and then another factor allows the negative behavior to become manifest. And by the way, those first two enzymes, MAO-alpha and COMT, are enzymes that are important in pharmacology as well. So they're old friends to me. I was happy to see them crop up here. Another break. This is Mount Constance on the Olympic Peninsula at Washington State. It wasn't far from where we used to live, but we didn't see it on most days because of the famous Puget Sound weather. Now let's switch gears and look at a specific brain region, the amygdala. It has lots of jobs, and this is a partial list. Detects danger, generates fear, involved in behavior, emotional control, etc., etc. And for our purposes, activation of the amygdala can lead to antisocial or aggressive behaviors and violence. And notice how many arrows are pointing at amygdala activation. And these are only the ones that would fit on the figure. There are many others as well. So here's some direct evidence of the connection between amygdala activation and negative violent behavior. This is pretty astonishing, actually, when you think about it. Sticking an electrode into someone's amygdala and stimulating it, as is done before certain types of neurosurgery, produces rage. And patients with amygdala-induced seizures may develop uncontrollable aggression with the seizures. And you say, well, that's fine, but how many people does this apply to? Well, not that many, but unfortunately there are many other ways our amygdalas can get activated. Chronic stress can do it. People with PTSD often have amygdala activation. Tumors of the amygdala can be involved. There also can be genetic predispositions. A person with strong racist tendencies can have amygdala activation. Problems during the prenatal period can cause amygdala activation. Seizures, as we mentioned a moment ago, and severe childhood abuse, and other factors as well. There's a partial list. So let's look at someone who had two of these factors that activate the amygdala, a tumor and childhood abuse. This is Charles Whitman, one of the first mass shooters, now unfortunately a daily occurrence. I was at University of California, San Francisco at the time. This was 1966. And I remember how shocked we all were. I mean, it was major front page news for a long time. Only nowadays, not so shocking. Let me go. There we go. At age 25, Whitman climbed up into a tower on the University of Texas and shot and killed over a dozen people. Now, he was an Eagle Scout, married engineering major with a high IQ. He wouldn't be high on anyone's list as a likely mass shooter, and even he knew something was wrong. He'd been having severe headaches and violent urges, and he asked for an autopsy of his brain in a suicide note. So he knew there was something messed up. And sure enough, an autopsy found a glioblastoma pressing on his amygdala, so he did have a tumor. He had also been, they found out later, severely abused throughout childhood by his father. So here's the question. If these murders occurred today and Whitman survived, is there even a remote possibility he would not get a death sentence? I think we all know the answer to this question. Texas hasn't been shy about executing people, and they wouldn't know about the tumor, but even if they did know about the tumor, I doubt it would have helped him avoid a death sentence. Because even if they did know about the tumor, the prosecutor will almost certainly use the gotcha question. Does everyone with amygdala damage and a history of child abuse commit murder? And of course the answer is no. But this is the wrong question. The prosecutor is cleverly using the old burden of proof switcheroo. The correct question is, were it not for the brain damage and child abuse, would he have killed these people? Given what we know about the science, it's very plausible, actually, that he would not have committed these murders. We can't know for sure, but it's very plausible that he would not have. Now, no one could possibly answer this question with any degree of certainty, even somebody as knowledgeable as Professor Sapolsky. So, given the uncertainty, is it moral to have him killed instead of protecting society by sending him to prison? I would say no. Sorry. I went too fast. It has to be plausible, of course. You can't claim that the phase of the moon caused his behavior, but when it is plausible, I would argue that it is indeed immoral to sentence him to death. Okay, another mini break. This is Mount Rainier sunrise. I took this from the exact same spot as the previous Mount Constance photo on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. One of the rare days when it was actually clear. Now let's look at another brain region, the frontal cortex, a very useful structure. It can stifle violent urges, and when it's not working properly, antisocial behavior can occur. So if your amygdala says to punch someone in the face, the frontal cortex may say, hey, wait a minute, not a good idea. So now, it's not fully mature until we are in our mid-20s, which raises the question of why anybody under the age of 25 was ever given a death penalty, or for that matter, life in prison without parole. Now, as Professor Sapolsky says, quote, the frontal cortex makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. So a properly functioning frontal cortex is vital to reining in aggressive or violent behavior. Now back to our diagram. Many factors can cause malfunction of the frontal cortex, and you see them, the arrows there. Mental illness, age under 25, stress, tumors, trauma, etc. And again, these are the only ones I could fit on the slide. So the question is, someone with severe frontal cortex damage commits murder, should they be given a death sentence? Up to now, the answer seems to be yes. There are many people on death row that have damage to their frontal cortex. But it is just as with the amygdala activation, the prosecutor will almost certainly ask this question: does everyone who has malfunction of a frontal cortex commit murder? And of course the answer is no. But it's the wrong question. So again, the prosecutor is using the old burden of proof switcheroo. The prosecutor is likely to say, not everyone who has frontal cortex damage commits murder, so the burden of proof is on you to prove that it was involved in this murder. But the defense could rightfully respond, that's an impossible standard to ever meet. Even if 80% of people with such damage committed violent crimes, one could never prove it played a role in any given violent crime. There are no proofs in human behavior, only probabilities. So let's look at the most famous case of frontal cortex damage in history, Phineas Gage. Gage was a foreman on a construction crew in Vermont. They were blasting rock. He poured some powder in a hole, got distracted, and then he tamped it with the iron bar, and boom, it exploded, and the iron bar went through his left cheek, took out his left eye, and took out his frontal lobes. Now, he survived. That's the good news, but the bad news started quickly. This is a photo of him years later, actually. But the bad news started quickly. His personality completely deteriorated. He became impulsive, indecisive, selfish, profane, basically turned into a jerk. And this is very typical of these cases. Intellectually and physically, he was fine, but his personality had completely changed. The implication, as Antonio Damasio said in his book Descartes' Error, quote, something as close to the human soul as ethical judgment might depend significantly on a specific area of the brain. When I read this book in 1994, this was just a revelation to me. You can still see Gage's skull at the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard. I get to Boston periodically, but I was never able to get there when the museum was open. Finally, just a few weeks ago, I was there at the right time, and I was able to get in, and I took these photos. Very exciting day for me. So Damasio, who's a neurologist, then described a modern Phineas Gage. He called him Elliot from his medical practice. Same thing. A good husband, father, successful at his job. He developed severe headaches, and then a brain tumor was found in his frontal lobes. They took his frontal lobes out, and his intellect, as with Phineas Gage, the intellect was intact, but his life just fell apart in a very similar way to Phineas Gage's. Lost his job, his money, divorced twice, as did Phineas Gage. Damasio said, quote, it is appropriate to say that his free will had been compromised just by injury to a particular area of the brain. Now, reading Descartes' Error fundamentally changed how I looked at the world. In my 20s, as I got deeper into my scientific work, I began to question how much control people have over their actions and human free will. I became a skeptic. But it was just a fun thought experiment, not something I applied to my everyday life. But this book changed all that. And by the way, it completely changed my attitude towards a certain person in my life who acted much like Phineas Gage and Elliot. He still drove me crazy, but I was able to substantially increase the percentage of time I felt empathy for him, and I completely stopped hating him. And this inability to hate will come up again later in a video on free will, where we will discuss another one of Professor Sapolsky's blockbuster books, Determined. This one just came out maybe 6 months ago, but that's for a later video. Now, Nietzsche saw where this was headed 150 years ago. He said, even if the inherited habit of erroneous esteeming and hating continues to govern us, it will grow weaker under the influence of growing knowledge. And here he meant scientific knowledge. Nietzsche had a habit of being ahead of his time, and here's yet another example. Neuroscientists like Dr. Sapolsky have proven Nietzsche right. So, scientific progress is eroding justification for the death penalty. As science progresses, more and more about human behavior will be found to have biological origins. And as an aside, I'm not glorifying science here. Science has been very successful, partly because it's self-correcting. Excuse me, but it does need self-correcting. So science isn't the answer to everything by any means, but it's a very valuable tool that we really need to use when we can. So it became increasingly difficult for people to say it's simple, these people are evil and they have rotten souls. It became a lot more complicated than that. Now, keep in mind that we've only touched on a very small part of the origins of human behavior. We left most of this figure untouched. And of course, science has much more to discover. We don't know what we don't know. But when we ask a jury to decide if a defendant should be killed, we are presuming that they can navigate this maze and come up with a reasonable decision. We don't even know why we act the way we do. I've got a book back there on those shelves somewhere on procrastination. I got it about 10 years ago. I haven't cracked it open once. So why do I do that? I have no idea. So we are engaging in magical thinking when we think that we fallible humans can judge what's in another person's heart and mind when they commit a crime. Now, this concludes part one about the behavior of the accused. Here's the big another palate cleanser. The Big Quilcene River is also on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. It was one of our favorite hikes along this river. So now let's move on to part two. And it's going to be shorter than part one, so don't worry. Part two is the complex behavior of everyone involved in a capital case. So all of those things you saw on that slide, with all the arrows and everything, all that stuff applies to everybody else too. It's not just the accused, not just the defendant, whose behavior is complex. So the thoughts and actions of everyone involved in a capital case are affected by the same vastly complex and interwoven factors as the defendant. So everybody, police, DAs, defense attorneys, judges, juries, everybody. So we're all subject to these same influences. And again, this is a partial slide showing many of the things that affect our behavior. Now, how about judges? Aren't they the epitome of impartiality? Michel de Montaigne said, almost 500 years ago, as for a judge who brings with him from his home the pain of the gout, jealousy, or the pilfering of his valet, a judge whose soul is dyed and steeped in anger, there is no doubt that his judgment is biased in that direction. Now, I hate it when my valet pilfers. I'm sure you do too. But Montaigne's insights into human nature come up often in these videos, especially intellectual humility, which was one of Montaigne's main points, intellectual humility. And a couple hundred years later, Cesare Beccaria brought this same issue up. He said, the spirit of the law, therefore, would be the upshot of good or bad logic on the part of the judge and the state of his digestion, and would depend on the turbulence of his emotions and all those tiny pressures which, to the wavering mind of man, change the appearance of every object. So let's focus on this part of the quote, the state of his digestion, where he proposes that the judge's thinking would be influenced by what's going on there. So fast forward another 250 years, and we see how prescient Beccaria was. This is a study where they took 8 judges and looked at the rate of positive parole rulings for a whole day before and after food breaks. Now, this study was published in the prestigious Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it's survived actually very well in the face of criticism. They got a lot of criticism early on, but it's been able to answer those questions. Now, on the vertical y-axis is the proportion of favorable decisions, parole decisions. In other words, parole was granted. On the horizontal axis is time from the beginning to the end of the day. Notice at the beginning of the day, to the far left of the timeline, 70% of people roughly were granted parole, but that steeply declined to 0 right before the judges had food. Then the judges had food, and it went back up to 70% again. The pattern repeated again. So what could be causing this? Well, Professor Sapolsky suggests that perhaps hypoglycemia. It can diminish proper functioning of the frontal cortex, and the frontal cortex is vital for making tough decisions, like a parole decision. It requires a lot of energy, and for the brain, that means glucose. That's the only food it likes, glucose. But it's a moot point if something other than hypoglycemia was causing this decline in positive parole decisions. Obviously, something other than the merits of the cases affected these parole decisions. So that's a very interesting study. What about other influences? Well, do moral values change with the seasons? Well, conservative values like authority, purity, and loyalty were higher in spring and fall. Now, the figure on the right shows authority, but loyalty and purity the curves look very similar for them. So these values are known to increase punitive urges. So a jury is more likely to vote for a death penalty as opposed to a long prison sentence in spring and fall, one would assume. Probably true. We don't know that for sure, but I'm sure somebody can do a study of that. So maybe defendants in capital cases should avoid being tried in spring and fall. Is this caused by increase in anxiety? It's not really clear, but possibly. But again, the precise mechanism is moot. As long as the changes are there, whether it's increased anxiety or some other unconscious mechanism, it doesn't really matter. Okay, another diversion. This is the Hungarian Parliament building. I took this from a boat on the Danube one evening. Hungary is, by the way, is one of almost 150 countries that have abolished the death penalty by law or in practice. So even Russia has abolished the death penalty, but I've noticed that exceptions are sometimes made if you piss off Putin. But other than that, you won't get executed in Russia either. Now let's look at Ernest Becker. First, some background on Ernest Becker. Becker was a remarkable thinker. His most famous book is Denial of Death, won a Pulitzer Prize, I believe, in 1974, something like that. But if you haven't read Becker, I would recommend a shorter book, also by him, called Escape from Evil. It's more succinct, and it covers pretty much all the issues that he covered in Denial of Death. Now, I was involved in the Ernest Becker Foundation for a number of years when I lived in Seattle, and I've spent a lot of time discussing his ideas. And I was delighted to see that legal scholars have applied Becker's ideas to the criminal legal system, especially the death penalty. So one of Becker's central ideas was that the terror of death can lead to negative behavior towards people we label as other. So the denial of our finitude, mortality, through cultural meaning, the idea is that we live on through our culture even after we die. It's sort of a coping mechanism. So if our own mortality is brought to our awareness, if we have increased awareness of our own mortality, this can lead to punitive attitudes towards people we label as other. Now, this has been shown in hundreds of studies around the world. So this is not a debatable point that this happens. Again, it's moot if we don't have the underlying mechanism exactly right. It's the change in behavior that is undeniable. And that's what, for our purposes, what we're interested in. Now, law professor Donald Judges, great name for a law professor, he argued that death awareness increases support for the death penalty, and I think he's probably right. Mortality salience, being reminded of your own mortality, boosts aggression, punitive urges, and authoritarianism. And as I said, this relationship is beyond dispute. It's been shown in hundreds of studies. And also keep in mind, these are on average. Some people are more susceptible to this effect than others. Some people don't have much change and others have a huge change. So it's plausible that in dealing with a death penalty case, this may make some people more aware of their own mortality. And I'm going to guess that making people think of their own demise may activate the insular cortex, which we'll talk about more in a later lecture, leading to amygdala activation. I haven't cleared this yet with Professor Sapolsky. He may have other pathways that he thinks are more important, but here's at least a possibility. So, seeing courtroom evidence of a grisly murder is likely to increase subconscious death anxiety, especially if the victim is the same race and social class as the juror. And this argument was made by another law professor, Jeffrey Kirschmeyer, who brought up this issue about jurors. And actually, it makes a lot of sense. And here's an actual study looking at Ernest Becker's ideas on judge behavior. And I'll warn you ahead of time that some of you will have trouble believing this study. But the results have been, even the researchers had trouble believing that they got the results they did. But the results have been corroborated over and over again. And I'm not picking on judges. I'm sure the vast majority make every effort to be impartial. It's just that no human being can possibly achieve complete impartiality. Whoops, I went too far. So they took 22 municipal court judges, 15 male, 7 female. They randomly assigned them to 2 groups. On the left, those 11 were asked to think carefully about their own demise, so mortality salience. The other half on the right were asked to think about some neutral topic. Then they were all asked to set bail for a prostitution case. And drum roll, what do you think the difference will be? Well, the people who were asked to think about their own mortality, very specifically about their own mortality, the bail they set was $455, and for the others, $50. People not familiar with Becker's ideas are sometimes incredulous. Okay. This study was done by Solomon, Greenberg, and Pazinski probably over 30 years ago. They were the original researchers on that. And their book, The Worm at the Core, is an excellent summary of Becker's ideas and the research corroborating his theories. So what they said was, when they saw these results of the judge study, the scales of justice were tipped, if not toppled, by the judges who had pondered their demise. So also from Worm at the Core, there's always the lingering death anxiety that humans project onto other groups of people whom they designate as evil that must be destroyed. So ironically then, a good deal of evil in the world results from efforts to rid the world of evil. And this applies to the death penalty as well as many conflicts that we have going on around the world. Again, Nietzsche already said this. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And when you look long into the abyss also looks into you. Now, up to now, or in the home stretch here, up to now we've been discussing largely unconscious bias, but what about intentional misconduct? Do the same complex origins of human behavior apply? For example, Kevin Cooper, who was wrongly convicted about 40 years ago, he spent 40 years condemned to death despite credible evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. There were multiple Brady violations, 7 or 8 of them, perjured expert testimony. Almost certainly they destroyed exculpatory evidence, and they planted incriminating evidence. They tampered with witnesses, which is pretty clear, and they ignored everybody else who could possibly have been involved. So we can ask the same question here. What caused these people to become the type of people who would commit such misconduct? Now, we don't give them a pass. What they did was wrong. But we might be able to, by analyzing it, maybe explain why they did this. Now, this is what, on the left, is what he looked like after his arrest. So it isn't a stretch to think that racism may have played a role in the prosecutorial misconduct, but there are probably other things going on as well. So, to the conclusion, the origins of human behavior are astonishingly complex. And determining how anyone became the type of person who would commit violence against other humans is impossible. And finally, when we select which human beings should be killed by the state, we are committing an unconscionable act of hubris. We need to have a little more intellectual humility. We are committing magical thinking when we decide some murderers deserve to be executed and others do not. This is a conjecture based on our ignorance of the origins of human behavior, as well as our subconscious biases, hunches, hatreds, fears, and emotions. So the question is, do we know enough to kill? The answer is pretty clear, not even close. Thank you for your attention.